Heinrich Himmler. Most people know him as the architect of the Holocaust, Hitler's right hand, leader of the SS and Gestapo. But what if that's only half the story? What if Himmler was running something far more sophisticated? A hidden empire, a secret financial network, millions in gold, stolen art, and priceless treasures systematically extracted, hidden, and moved to safety. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of Himmler's shadow, his secret wealth, his escape networks, and the fortune that still hasn't been found. Welcome to the Untold History. Voices from WW2. Most people think they know Heinrich Himmler. They picture him in photographs, thin-faced, bespectacled, wearing SS uniform. They know him as the orchestrator of genocide, the architect of Auschwitz, the man responsible for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. But this image is incomplete, because Heinrich Himmler was more than a genocidal administrator. He was a businessman, an accountant, a financial strategist who understood that the Nazi state required not just military power, but economic control. And in the machinery of Nazi genocide, Himmler recognized an extraordinary opportunity: industrial-scale wealth extraction. To understand Himmler, you must first understand his origins. He was born in Munich in 1900 to a respectable middle-class family. His father was a teacher and tutor to Bavarian royalty. The Himmler household was cultured, disciplined, and deeply conservative. Young Heinrich grew up in this environment of order and hierarchy values that would define his entire life. He was not a natural revolutionary. He was not charismatic. He did not inspire crowds with fiery speeches like Hitler or Goebbels. He was quiet, methodical, obsessive about detail. By all accounts, he was the kind of man you might not notice at a party unremarkable, even dull. But this ordinariness masked something darker, an almost pathological capacity for organizational brutality. After World War I, Himmler drifted into the Nazi movement. In 1923, he participated in the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed coup attempt in Munich. He was captured, briefly imprisoned, and emerged from jail a committed Nazi ideologue. But unlike other Nazi veterans, Himmler did not seek fame or military glory. He sought power through administration. In 1929, at age 29, Himmler became the leader of the SS. At that time, the SS was a small organization, just 290 men, a bodyguard unit for Nazi leadership. No one imagined it would become anything significant. But Himmler saw potential. He saw an organization that could be built, expanded, controlled. Over the next 15 years, he transformed the SS from a small militia into a massive, semi-independent state within the Nazi state, complete with its own police force, the Gestapo, its own intelligence service, its own military divisions, and, most importantly, its own economic apparatus. By the 1942, Himmler controlled more power than any individual except Hitler himself. He ran the concentration camps, he ran the Gestapo, he ran the SS Totenkopf, Verbände, Death's Head units, he ran the intelligence services, and beneath all these official responsibilities, he ran something else entirely: a vast, hidden network for the extraction, accumulation, and concealment of wealth. This is where the real story begins. Because Himmler understood something that many other Nazi leaders did not. The Holocaust could be monetized. Every Jew who was deported could be stripped of their property. Every Jewish business could be seized. Every piece of jewelry, every painting, every piece of currency could be collected, centralized, and converted into resources for the Nazi state or for personal enrichment. Himmler created a system. He called it the Freundschaftskreis Himmler, Himmler's Circle of Friends. It was, ostensibly, a social club for wealthy businessmen and Nazi leaders. But it was far more than that. It was a blatant money laundering operation, a mechanism through which stolen Jewish wealth could be converted into legitimate Nazi economic activity. German industrialists would contribute to the circle. In exchange, They received contracts, protection, and access to slave labor from concentration camps. The SS would provide workers prisoners from the camps to work in factories, mines, and construction projects. The industrialists would profit enormously from free labor. The SS would receive a percentage of the profits. Everyone in the circle would become wealthy. And the source of all this wealth? The systematic robbery of an entire people. By 1943, Himmler's financial empire had become extraordinary. He controlled assets worth hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. He had access to gold seized from Jewish victims, art and antiques from across occupied Europe, currency reserves extracted from conquered nations, diamonds and precious stones, corporate assets taken from Jewish businesses, real estate holdings across the Reich. But here's what makes Himmler's story unique. He knew the war was lost. By 1943 to 1944, it was becoming clear to anyone with access to military intelligence that Germany could not win. The Soviet advance from the east was unstoppable. The American and British advance from the west was accelerating. The war would end in Nazi defeat. It was only a matter of time. Himmler began to think about what would happen after the war, and so he created something remarkable: an escape network. A system for preserving Nazi wealth and Nazi operatives after the inevitable collapse. He established secret accounts in Switzerland. He arranged for art and gold to be smuggled across borders. He created false identities for high-ranking SS officers. He established what would later be called rat lines escape routes that would allow Nazis to flee Europe and disappear into South America. Himmler was preparing for his own survival, and he was preparing his network to survive him. This is the story that history often misses. The story of Himmler not just as a genocidal administrator, but as a sophisticated financial criminal who built a system so effective that pieces of it remained operational decades after his death. To understand Himmler's hidden economy, you must first understand how the Nazi system actually functioned. The popular image of the Nazi state is of a monolithic machine, a single will, Hitler's, driving all actions. But the reality was far more complex. The Nazi state was actually a competing network of power centers, each fighting for resources and influence. Different government agencies, military branches, and party organizations were constantly maneuvering for authority. Hitler permitted this chaos deliberately, believing that competition between subordinates kept them loyal to him and prevented any single lieutenant from becoming too powerful. This institutional chaos created extraordinary opportunities. Within this fragmented system, Himmler and the SS carved out an independent power base. The SS was technically answerable to Hitler, but in practice operated with remarkable autonomy. By the early 1942, the SS controlled the Gestapo, secret, the SD intelligence service, the Waffen-SS military divisions, the concentration camp system, ethnic cleansing operations, vast tracts of real estate. But the Ruhmesses 2000 Paste C. SS's most lucrative operation was the exploitation of the concentration camps. The camps were not simply killing centers. They were labor camps, economic enterprises. The prisoners were treated as a raw material resource to be worked to death, and in the process, to generate profit. The SS leased out prisoners to German corporations. Companies like Siemens, Bayer, Krupp Steel, and IG Farben contracted with the SS to provide workers. They paid a monthly fee per prisoner, typically a few Reichsmarks, and in exchange received unlimited workers who could be driven at whatever pace the companies desired, with no concern for their survival. This was extraordinarily profitable for everyone involved. A prisoner might be worth 200 to 500 Reichsmarks per month to a corporation. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and you have a vast economic engine. The corporations made enormous profits. The SS received regular payments, and the prisoners were worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. It was, quite literally, industrial genocide converted into profit. But this is only the beginning of Himmler's economic machinery. There was also the gold extraction process. When prisoners arrived at the camps, they were stripped. Everything was taken: clothes, shoes, jewelry, false teeth, the gold was extracted, hair used in industrial processes, even the fillings. From the teeth of the dead, nothing was wasted. Everything of value was catalogued, sorted, and sent to central collection points. The gold alone, thousands of kilos per year, was processed, melted, and stored. The art and antiquities operation was equally sophisticated. The Nazis systematized the theft of art and historical artifacts from occupied Europe. Himmler had a particular obsession with Germanic history and mythology. He commissioned expeditions to search for ancient artifacts believed to have mystical significance. But beyond this ideological obsession, he recognized that European art was extraordinarily valuable. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, rare books, these could be seized, stored, and eventually sold or bartered on the black market. By 1944, the SS controlled what amounted to a private collection of stolen art worth hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. The financial system was equally sophisticated. The Freundschaftskreis Himmler, Himmler's circle of friends, was ostensibly a social organization for elite Nazi members and wealthy businessmen. In reality, it was a money laundering and bribery scheme. Wealthy industrialists would contribute funds to the circle. In exchange, they received contracts for supplying the Nazi military-industrial complex, favorable tax treatment, and access to slave labor. Himmler's associates within the circle would take a cut of these payments, and the money would be distributed among the SS elite. It was a system of organized corruption operating within the Nazi state itself. By 1943, Himmler's financial position was extraordinary. He had become, in effect, the richest man in Nazi Germany after Hitler himself. His wealth was spread across multiple forms: cash, gold, art, real estate, corporate assets, and most importantly, power itself. He controlled the Gestapo, which gave him leverage over every other power center in the Nazi state. Anyone who threatened him faced the prospect of arrest, torture, and death. But by 1944, the war was clearly lost. Himmler began to understand that the Nazi state would collapse, and he began to think about what would happen to his wealth. This is where his network of international financial connections became crucial. Beginning in 1942 to 1943, Himmler began moving assets out of Germany. Through intermediaries in Switzerland, Sweden, and other neutral countries, vast sums were transferred to foreign bank accounts. Paintings and sculptures were smuggled across borders, hidden in diplomatic pouches. Gold was melted and recast to remove Nazi insignia, then moved through underground channels. The system that Himmler was building was not just designed to preserve Nazi ideology after the war, it was designed to preserve Nazi wealth. Switzerland during World War II was officially neutral. In practice, it was a financial haven for Nazi Germany. Swiss banks, particularly major institutions like the Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, and the Swiss Credit Bank, maintained extensive financial relationships with Nazi Germany throughout the war. Nazi gold deposits poured into Swiss vaults. Nazi officials opened personal accounts in Switzerland, and when the war began to turn against Germany, Swiss institutions became the crucial intermediary through which Nazi wealth was hidden, laundered, and eventually smuggled to safe havens around the world. Himmler understood this system intimately. He had associates in Switzerland, both German and Swiss, who facilitated these transactions. Money would be transferred from Berlin to Swiss accounts, where it would be converted into various forms and then moved to banks in South America, Argentina, Sweden, or other countries. The Swiss intermediaries would take a commission, and the Nazi wealth would emerge on the other side of the financial system, untraceable and safe. One of the most important figures in this network was Dr. Kurt Becher, an SS officer and businessman who worked directly with Himmler. Becher had connections to the Swiss financial system and was instrumental in moving Nazi assets to safety. After the war, Becher would survive, emigrate to the United States, and live a comfortable life presumably sustained by the portions of Nazi wealth that had been successfully transferred to safety. The specific mechanisms varied, but the basic pattern was consistent. 1. Asset extraction. Jews, political prisoners, and civilians from occupied territories were systematically robbed. Their property, businesses, and personal wealth were seized. 2. Centralization. These assets were gathered into central collection points controlled by the SS. 3. Conversion. Assets were converted into forms that could be easily moved internationally, primarily gold, currency, and art. 4. Transfer. Through Swiss intermediaries and banking channels, the converted assets were moved to foreign bank accounts. 5. Distribution. The assets would be distributed among Nazi officials who had made arrangements for their post-war survival. Some would be held in trust for later recovery. The sheer scale of this operation was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that Nazi Germany extracted somewhere between $5 to $20 billion worth of assets, in modern currency, from occupied territories and Jewish victims. Not all of this wealth remained in Germany. A significant portion was successfully transferred abroad. Where did it go? The primary destinations were Switzerland, billions in gold and currency held in Swiss banks, much of it never repatriated or accounted for. Sweden. Swedish banks similarly received Nazi deposits. Sweden's neutrality proved quite profitable for Swedish financial institutions. Argentina. This became the primary destination for Nazi operatives and Nazi wealth after the war. Argentina's relative isolation and lack of extradition treaties made it attractive. Brazil and Paraguay, similarly used as repositories for Nazi wealth and hiding places for Nazi operatives. Portugal, another officially neutral country that became a financial conduit. The transfers were not always straightforward. Often, assets would move through multiple intermediaries. A painting stolen from a Jewish family in France might be sold in Switzerland to a neutral Swedish businessman who would then sell it to a Brazilian collector, who might eventually sell it again. By the time the painting reached its final destination, its provenance had been completely obscured. Any record of its being stolen Nazi loot would be lost. Similarly, gold would be melted, recast, mixed with neutral gold from other sources, and eventually emerge in markets as legitimate bullion, with no traceable connection to its original theft. The key figure in Himmler's Swiss operations appears to have been someone called Kaltenbrunner's man, though the historical record is deliberately obscure on this point. What we know is that by 1944, Himmler had established what amounted to a personal financial empire operating outside official Nazi state channels. This personal empire was the insurance policy that would allow Himmler to survive the war, or so he thought. The scale of Himmler's personal wealth was extraordinary. Historians estimate that by 1945, Himmler controlled personal assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. This included gold bullion and currency deposited in Swiss banks, art and antiquities valued in the tens of millions, real estate holdings across occupied Europe, corporate assets and shares in German industries, valuable manuscripts and historical artifacts. But here's the crucial question. What happened to this wealth? Some of it was certainly recovered by Allied forces. Some was abandoned when Himmler fled, but a substantial portion appears to have vanished, moved to locations, and under names that made it impossible to trace. After the war, investigators and journalists would spend decades searching for evidence of Himmler's hidden wealth. They would find hints, transfers to Swiss accounts, paintings that surfaced in unexpected places, gold that appeared on black markets. But the full picture remained elusive. The reason? Because the system Himmler had created was designed to remain hidden even after his death. The Swiss banks had no incentive to reveal the truth about Nazi accounts. The countries that had harbored Nazi wealth had every incentive to deny it. And the network of Nazi operatives and collaborators who had benefited from the system were spread across the world, protected by distance and secrecy. By 1944, Heinrich Himmler was a man facing his own mortality. The war was lost. Germany was being invaded from both east and west. Soviet armies were advancing across Eastern Europe, American and British forces were advancing through France and toward Germany itself. The collapse was not a matter of if, but when. Himmler understood this, and he began to prepare. What he created was something remarkable, an escape network designed to allow Nazi operatives to survive, hide, and eventually flourish in the post-war world. This network would later become known as the rat lines, the underground routes through which Nazi war criminals would escape to South America and other safe havens. The rat lines did not spontaneously appear at the end of the war. They were planned, organized, financed, and many of them were created through Himmler's initiative. The basic structure of the rat lines worked like this. 1. Safe houses. Throughout Europe, particularly in Italy, Austria and Switzerland, the SS established safe houses where fugitive Nazis could hide. These safe houses were often run by Catholic clergy who, either through ideology or coercion, cooperated with the escape network. 2. False identities. The SS created elaborate systems for producing false documents, passports, travel permits, identity cards that would allow Nazis to travel under assumed names and identities. 3. Routes. Established pathways would move fugitives from Germany through Austria, down through Italy, and then to ports where they could board ships to South America. Financial support. Himmler's hidden wealth would be used to fund the entire operation, paying for transportation, forged documents, safe houses, and bribes to officials. 5. Destinations. The primary destination was Argentina, but also Brazil, Paraguay, and other South American countries with weak extradition treaties and porous borders. The most famous ratline leader was Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lion, who after the war was employed by the US to military intelligence as an informant, and then eventually escaped to South America, where he lived comfortably for decades before finally being extradited. But Barbie was just one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Nazi operatives who successfully used the rat lines to escape. What was Himmler's role in all this? Historians believe that Himmler directly authorized the creation of several rat lines and provided the financial resources necessary for them to function. He did this for several reasons. 1. Ideological continuity. He believed that even if Nazi Germany fell, Nazi ideology would survive. By preserving Nazi operatives, he was ensuring that the ideology could be perpetuated in exile. 2. Personal survival. Himmler knew that if he was caught, he would be tried, convicted, and executed. The rat lines represented his insurance policy for survival. 3. Wealth preservation. The rat lines were connected to the system of Nazi wealth transfer. The same operatives who were escaping were often also transfers of considerable wealth to South America. Himmler's vision was of a scattered Nazi network spread across South America and other continents, remaining ideologically connected, financially supported, and ready to reorganize if circumstances permitted. It was, in essence, a plan for Nazi continuity beyond Nazi Germany. This plan largely succeeded not because Himmler himself survived, he did not, but because the network he created functioned after his death. The rat lines did operate. Nazi operatives did escape. Some accumulated considerable wealth. And in places like Argentina, a community of Nazi exiles did establish themselves and maintain contact with one another. The most famous example is Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics, who lived under an assumed name in Argentina for over a decade before being captured by Israeli Mossad in 1960. But there were hundreds of others, doctors who conducted experiments on prisoners, SS officers who ran concentration camps, Gestapo torturers, all living comfortable lives in South America, many dying of natural causes, never facing justice for their crimes. This was Himmler's vision realized without him, and it was financed, at least partially, with the wealth that he had accumulated and hidden. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. The war was clearly lost. Hitler was becoming increasingly irrational in his underground bunker. German generals were attempting to negotiate surrender terms. And Himmler, who had once been the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, found himself increasingly irrelevant. But Himmler was not a man to accept irrelevance passively. In late April 1945, with the war clearly ending, Himmler made a fateful decision. He attempted to negotiate peace with the Allies without Hitler's knowledge or permission. Through Swedish intermediaries, Himmler sent proposals to the Western Allies, primarily the British and Americans, offering to surrender German forces under SS command in exchange for amnesty and recognition as a legitimate government authority in the post-war period. Himmler apparently believed that he could position himself as a partner in building the post-war European order. When Hitler learned of this betrayal, he was furious. Hitler ordered Himmler arrested and executed. But by this point, Hitler's orders were hollow. No one was following them. Himmler escaped the bunker and fled Berlin. What happened next is documented in various accounts, though the details remain somewhat disputed. Himmler apparently travelled to northern Germany, seeking to hide or to turn himself over to the British, whom he hoped might be more sympathetic than the Russians. He used a false name, a totally fictional identity, and attempted to blend in with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. On the 21st of May 1945, near the German-Danish border, Himmler was recognized and arrested by British forces. The British immediately recognized his significance and placed him in custody. They held him for 2 days while military intelligence interrogated him. During this period, Himmler was defiant and unrepentant. He refused to provide information. He claimed that many of his actions had been necessary for the state. He seemed to believe, even at the end, that he had done nothing that would ultimately be held against him. On the 23rd of May, 1945, while being examined by a military physician in preparation for formal trial, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his teeth and died within minutes. He was 44 years old. The British were shocked. They had wanted to interrogate him extensively, to extract information about the Nazi state's inner workings, the location of hidden Nazi assets, and the names of other Nazi operatives who had escaped. Now, with Himmler's sudden death, much of this information was lost. Or was it? In the confusion of Himmler's death, many questions remained unanswered. How much of his wealth was actually recovered? Allied investigators found evidence of vast SS holdings, but they could never account for all of them. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of millions in Nazi wealth was never officially recovered or accounted for. What was the full extent of the Ratlines network that he created? Some of the escape routes that Himmler had established became operational after his death, and historians believe that many of the Nazi operatives who successfully escaped to South America used networks that Himmler had originally designed. Where are the hidden art and antiquities that Himmler accumulated? Many paintings and sculptures that were stolen during the Nazi period have never been located. Some are believed to have been hidden in locations known only to Himmler, and the knowledge of their location died with him. What was in the Swiss accounts that bore Himmler's names? After the war, Swiss banks would claim that they could find no accounts associated with Himmler, but historians and investigators suspect that Himmler used front men and dummy corporations to conceal accounts that may have contained significant wealth. Himmler's death was, in many ways, a perfect ending for his career. It cut off investigation. It prevented him from ever being tried for his crimes, though his deputy, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, would eventually be tried and executed. And it left behind mysteries that would haunt historians for decades. After Himmler's death, the investigations began. Allied intelligence agencies, particularly American and British intelligence, launched extensive investigations into Nazi assets, Nazi networks, and Nazi operatives who had escaped. They knew that Himmler had accumulated significant wealth. They knew that he had established international banking relationships. They knew that he had created escape networks. What they didn't know was the full extent of these operations, or how much wealth had actually been successfully hidden and transferred abroad. Over the following decades, various pieces of information emerged. The Swiss banking scandal. In the 1990 seconds, decades after the war had ended, investigations revealed that Swiss banks had indeed held Nazi accounts during and after the war. Billions of dollars in Nazi-related funds had flowed through Swiss financial institutions. Many of these accounts were never properly investigated or returned to victims' families. The Swiss banking system had profited enormously from Nazi Germany, both during the war and from the confusion and secrecy that followed. The Odessa network. In the 1960 seconds, investigative journalists and Nazi hunters began uncovering evidence of a post-war Nazi network called Odessa, Organization of Former SS Members. This network had helped Nazi operatives escape, had provided financial support to Nazi exiles in South America, and had maintained ideological connections. While some details of Odessa remain controversial and disputed, evidence suggests that some of the financial infrastructure for this network was established by Himmler before the end of the war. The art market. Throughout the post-war decades, stolen artwork began appearing in the art market. Paintings that had been known to be in Nazi collections would surface in Switzerland, Argentina, or other countries. Some were eventually traced and returned. Others disappeared into private collections, never to be seen again. Many are of the paintings that had been part of Himmler's personal collection pieces he had accumulated, often at gunpoint, from Jewish families and European museums, have never been located. The South American investigations. In the 1950 seconds, 1960 seconds, and 1970 seconds, investigators periodically discovered Nazi operatives living comfortable lives in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and other South American countries. Many of these men had accumulated significant wealth and seemed to be living well beyond what their official occupations would explain. Some historians believe that these ex-Nazis were sustained, at least partially, by the wealth that Himmler had arranged to be transferred to South America before the war's end. The Himmler Diaries. In 2016, the diaries of Heinrich Himmler pages that had been hidden since the end of the war were finally published and analyzed. These diaries provide remarkable insight into Himmler's daily activities, his meetings, his thoughts. They document the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust in meticulous detail, but they also hint at financial transactions, at meetings with Swiss intermediaries, at movements of valuable items, pieces of information that have led historians to believe that Himmler's hidden wealth operations were even more extensive than previously suspected. But despite all these investigations, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. How much of Himmler's wealth was actually recovered? Allied investigators found and seized significant Nazi assets, but they could never account for all of them. Historical estimates suggest that somewhere between 75% of the Nazi wealth that was moved to Switzerland and other neutral countries was successfully hidden and remains unaccounted for to this day. Where specifically is the hidden art and antiquities? Paintings and sculptures worth hundreds of millions of dollars that were stolen during the Nazi period have simply vanished. Some may be in private collections. Some may be hidden in locations known only to the few surviving Nazi operatives and their heirs. Some may be lost forever. How many Swiss accounts still contain Nazi wealth? Swiss banking secrecy, a policy that has only recently begun to be penetrated, means that accounts established by Nazis may still exist, hidden under false names and dummy corporations, with wealth that has been accumulating for over 75 years. Are there still operational rat lines? Some evidence suggests that the escape networks that Himmler established may have elements that remained operational decades after the war. Could Nazi operatives have continued to use these networks? Could wealth have continued to flow through them? These questions may never be definitively answered. The primary evidence, Himmler himself, died before he could be interrogated. The Swiss banks have consistently refused full disclosure of their wartime activities. The Nazi operatives who might have known the answers are either dead or have maintained their silence for 75+ years. What we know with certainty is this: Himmler created a system for extracting wealth, hiding it, and preserving it for the post-war world. That system largely succeeded. Hundreds of millions in Nazi assets were successfully hidden. Nazi operatives did escape and rebuild lives in South America, and decades later, pieces of this hidden wealth continue to surface, reminding us of the extent of Himmler's hidden empire. The story of Heinrich Himmler's hidden wealth is ultimately a story about the machinery of evil and its financial infrastructure. We often think of the Holocaust as a moral catastrophe, as it undoubtedly was, but we rarely think about it as an economic enterprise. We don't think about the fact that genocide was profitable. We don't think about the German industrialists who enriched themselves through slave labor. We don't think about the Swiss bankers who profited from Nazi deposits. We don't think about the network of corruption that turned human suffering into financial gain. Himmler understood all of this. He created systems to industrialize it. And when the war began to turn against Germany, he began preserving it, moving the wealth to safety, creating networks for escape, ensuring that even if Nazi Germany fell, the machinery of exploitation could survive and potentially flourish in the post-war world. Did it succeed? In many ways, yes. Nazi operatives did escape. Some accumulated significant wealth. Networks that Himmler established did continue to function. Wealth that Himmler helped hide remains unaccounted for. But the full story? We may never know it completely. The questions that haunt us 80 years later. Is there still Nazi wealth hidden in Swiss banks, under false names, accumulating interest? How many of the paintings and sculptures stolen from European museums and Jewish families are sitting in private collections, their provenance deliberately obscured? Did the networks that Himmler established continue to operate into the 1,950 seconds, 1,960 seconds, and beyond, supporting Nazi exiles with wealth that originated in the Holocaust? What conversations are occurring in the closed rooms of Swiss banking institutions, where they protect the secrets of their wartime depositors? These questions remain unanswered, and they may remain unanswered forever, as long as financial secrecy and institutional opacity persist. If you believe that history's darkest secrets deserve to be exposed, if you think the stories of hidden wealth and hidden operatives need to be told, then subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Do you think Himmler's wealth is still out there? Where do you think it's hidden? Share this video with anyone who cares about history, justice, and the often hidden machinery of genocide and exploitation. Because the greatest conspiracy theories are often the conspiracy that actually happened and that no one wants to talk about. We'll see you next video, where we explore another untold history, another hidden